Austin Briggs was born in Humboldt, Minnesota in 1908, and from an early age he spent most of his time drawing. In his teens he was awarded a scholarship to the Wicker Art School in Detroit, and at the age of only 16 he got a job as an assistant to an illustrator who specialised in images of cars for advertising. But Briggs quickly grew frustrated by this work and was eager to make a name for himself as an illustrator of fiction in books and magazines. And although bookwork never was forthcoming, in 1927 he had his first story illustration published in the Dearborn Independent. Following this modest debut, he soon started getting his work published in more prestigious national magazines, including Collier's, McClure's, Harper's and Liberty. And these early commissions were enough to convince him to move to New York in the hope of more not only from these clients, but as many others as he could acquire. But despite his promising start, the 1930 Wall Street crash and subsequent financial turmoil left him very much in the cold when the magazines themselves were struggling to stay afloat, and there was far less work to go around. So he used his time wisely by enrolling at the Art Students League to improve on his already considerable skills. And in the early 1930s, he started to have some success creating page monochromes for the pulp fiction magazine The Blue Book. Unlike the glosses, pulp magazines didn't rely on advertising to make a profit, and although work for the pulps was comparatively poorly paid, if the illustrator worked fast enough, he could make a decent living. So for the next few years, the Blue Book was Briggs's primary outlet, and it was undoubtedly his working relationship with this publication which kept him from going under during the lean years of the Depression. The fast turnaround required and the volume of drawn work he created quickly led to the refinement of his skills, and the varied narratives and constraints of layout and composition this work presented provided him with a learning curve that would be hard to equal. But despite his relative success in this arena, he became somewhat disillusioned with the demands of the business, and he took 4 months out to travel to the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada, where he spent his time painting and drawing the landscape. Briggs himself later stated that this experience affected his work very positively, and when he returned to New York he set about rebuilding the career he had almost abandoned. His sabbatical could have been career suicide, but luckily the Blue Book welcomed him back, and he appeared in virtually every copy of the magazine published into the 1940s. In 1938, Briggs had also taken over the illustration of the already established comic strip Secret Agent X9, and subsequently went on a couple of years later to do the same with the daily strip version of Flash Gordon, which, like Secret Agent X9, had been originally created some years earlier by Alex Raymond. He was uncredited for this work, but proved his worth in this context by successfully suppressing his own style for a quite credible version of Raymond's pen and ink linear approach and penchant for dynamic composition. He continued to create monochrome work for the Blue Book throughout the years of the war, and he was still working on Flash Gordon as late as 1947. But at that point his fortunes took a pronounced upturn when he finally managed to gain a foothold again in the higher profile and better rewarded world of glossy mainstream magazines, including the prestigious Cosmopolitan and the Saturday Evening Post. And by the end of the 40s he was appearing regularly in any number of glossy magazines and being paid considerably more generously. And in much of the work he was now producing, he was able to work with growing frequency in full colour alongside other monochrome and limited palette work. Like many of his counterparts in this market, Briggs worked regularly in oil paint, although he was also known to create his images using opaquely applied gouache and even watercolour in a similarly effective manner. The profile this magazine work gave him led to more of a similar kind, and even more profitable commissions for press ads for any number of corporate clients, who were keen to harness his flair for evoking the American dream with sincerity and visual plausibility. At the time, Norman Rockwell was considered to be the greatest and most successful exponent of this kind of work, and like many of his contemporaries working in magazines and advertising, Briggs generally fell in line with this broad representational approach, although he certainly could not be accused of being a mere copyist. Briggs obviously used models to pose for the scenes he created, but whether he took photographs or drew from life, or even combined the two, I've been unable to find out. Given the complexity and staging of some of his work, it seems most likely he would have used photography as the basis of most of these images, and more than likely created the final image from composite sources. Some of his work was at least begun on location, to which he frequently travelled, and presumably either made drawings or took photographs before returning to the studio to complete the work. There is also evidence that he created rough visuals of the scenes he was commissioned to produce, to inform the considerably more precise finished artwork. And if nothing else, these drawings would have been invaluable guides for the magazine's graphic designers, who put together the pages so they could imaginatively incorporate the headings and text with the image. This approach to layout was a defining aspect of virtually every mainstream American magazine of the period, and Briggs's work lent itself particularly well to this type of editorial design. It was also in the later 1940s that Briggs became one of the 12 established commercial illustrators, including Rockwell himself, who made up Albert Dorn's famous artist correspondence course. And together they helped to steer younger illustrators into good practice and find their own way into the business, in which he and his colleagues had enjoyed such considerable success. His own popularity continued undiminished, and among other high-profile commissions, as the 1940s drew to a close, Briggs created a series of colour paintings which were used in a press ad campaign for American Airlines. This campaign in particular traded on Briggs's ability to capture the same wholesome and reassuring all-American appeal that was a defining characteristic of the period. Like many of his contemporaries in the USA, Briggs was somewhat typecast when it came to subject matter in both his advertising and editorial work, and his illustrations were overwhelmingly about the here and now. Whether it was depictions of Americans going about their daily business, romantic images of couples in and out of love, or gangsters and cops fighting it out on the mean streets, it was invariably one aspect or another of a world readily understood by his readers. But Briggs certainly wasn't typecast in stylistic terms, and as the 1950s unfolded, there was increasing evidence of a more personal and considerably less slavishly realistic representational quality in his work. This change was evolutionary rather than revolutionary, but increasingly it was his expressive and deceptively gestural approach to the creation of line work which began to define his illustrations, whether monochrome or in colour. The sensitivity of his drawing with lithography crayon, charcoal and other textural tools, and an equally enviable ability with brushed line work, proved immensely popular with some of his clients. But it wasn't exclusively the case that he would work in this looser, more expressionistic way, and he did simultaneously continue to create plenty of more traditionally coloured images in both oils and gouache. Whether this was decided by the client or Briggs himself I couldn't say, but whatever the case may have been, the range of methods and levels of painterly representation that his approaches encompassed led to a highly diverting and diverse body of mid-century illustration few others could hope to come close to. At times this versatility reached remarkable levels of diversity, to the extent that only the signature revealed that the more conventional side of his approach and his more radical drawings were the creation of the same man. Briggs continued to enjoy significant success with his work throughout the decade, and by the later years of the 1950s, many more clients in the advertising world started to get on board with a more modernist and less slavishly representational corporate image. And at the turn of the decade, he established a profitable professional relationship with the TV Guide, who commissioned him for a long-running ad campaign, its purpose being to convince potential clients to take advertising space in the magazine. And for all the deceptively loose, highly expressive illustrations he created, he drew the line work with a graphite stick, and then placed the drawings on a light box to see where the line work was, and added washes of monotone lamp black on another layer. The two were printed in separate runs, so that the original black line wasn't weakened by the half-tone print process. Briggs had never shown much interest in poster work, but he did create a couple of surprisingly unremarkable posters for the airline TWA as the 1960s began. but he certainly didn't need to augment his already considerable income with more work from anywhere other than magazines and press advertising. And into the 1960s, he maintained his position as one of the USA's most popular illustrators. By this point, his more gestural technique had clearly come to dominate his published work, although there was still the occasional, more conventionally rendered image created. By all accounts, Austin Briggs was a perfectionist who drove himself to the limits of his abilities, and many of his works in progress found their way into the wastebasket if he felt he wasn't meeting his own self-imposed rigorous standards. This completed image from the time and its original drawing clearly show that however spontaneous his illustrations looked, very little was left to chance. By the mid-1960s he had made more than enough money from his work, and he left the USA to live and work as an artist in Paris. But despite this decision and his expatriate status, he did continue to work as an illustrator from his new home and studio, and supplied a range of American magazines with more of his engrossing authentic images, even if with less frequency than before. Ironically, he produced some of his most compelling work at this time, and by this point the evidence clearly shows that he had ultimately chosen his expressive loose styling over more formal painted work. Although most of his output was for fiction, he also created other images reflecting on the Vietnam War, which were more journalistic in nature, and he travelled to the country during the conflict to make this series of highly credible journalistic pieces. Strangely, I failed to find a single solitary verified example of anything I could identify as art from this period, and unfortunately Austin Briggs fell victim to leukemia and died in Paris at the age of only 65 in 1973. Briggs had managed to enjoy real success in a period when the USA was positively bristling with talented and highly skilled commercial illustrators, many of whom were also teaching with the famous Artist Correspondence course. He proved himself in a wide range of outcomes and genres, from pulps and comic strip work through to full-blown painterly representational images and gestural linear expression. And the contribution he made in terms of persuading the American public that it wasn't necessarily the most realistic painted images which best captured the essence of human behaviour shouldn't be underestimated. And as I usually do, I'm going to end this tribute with a reminder of just why Austin Briggs deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest mid-20th century American illustrators.